Hi friends, welcome to the Eastern Front channel. Today we will talk about the memoirs of Friedrich Paulus adjutant Wilhelm. He fought with Paulus until he was captured in 1943. Let's try together to understand the reasons for the defeat of Paulus' army in Stalingrad. I shared a room in the cellars of the department store with Colonel General Paulus. Opposite, separated by a passage, sat the chief of staff with the remaining members of the staff camped in 2 or 3 other rooms. It must have been a vast department store, I thought, when I made a tour around it. Through the solidly built cellars ran a road-wide passage into which one could drive from the yard in a truck. There were storage rooms on either side that once had been lightened by large windows. Now piles of sandbags towered in front of the windows. Our vehicle stood in the passageway, protected by strong walls and ceilings against splinters and direct hits from lighter caliber weapons. The roof and upper stories were destroyed. The whole building had been burnt out down to the ground floor. Only the stone staircases remained that had once led to the roof. They seemed to sway, but could still be climbed in the gaps between shots. From the second story, one had a good view over the wide square. Opposite lay the ruins of a theater, and there, between the ruins and the east, gleamed the glassy water of the Volga. To the right of the theater curved the view of the Zaritsa, a deeply cut tributary of the Volga. Army headquarters lay in the 71st Infantry Division's area. Colonel Rosk, who had been tasked with its command following the death of General von Hartmann, was promoted to Major General on the 27th January. The soldiers of this division were in far better condition than those on the western and southern fronts. Since the beginning of the encirclement, they had always had well-constructed positions and even now still had heated accommodation, and, particularly astonishing, apparently sufficient provisions. What was the explanation? In my travels through the cellars, I came across several doors from which hung thick bars. I ordered the non-commissioned officer escorting me to open them. He obeyed my instructions unwillingly. The reason for his reluctance immediately became clear when I saw that the rooms were richly stacked with foodstuffs. Obviously, the quartermasters and paymasters, and apparently also the responsible commanders, had not reported these in November as they should have done. What a filthy swindle! If the other divisions on the northern and Stalingrad fronts, even if only in individual cases, had acted in the same way, one could easily imagine what huge quantities would have been withheld from the hard-fighting divisions on the western and southern fronts. Rosk admitted that he had let the reports of the responsible army officials go uncontrolled. On the 26th January, the Soviet units attacking from the west had linked up with elements of the 62nd Army advancing from the bank of the Volga at Mamai Kurgan. This hill, so bitterly fought over back in the autumn, was finally retaken by the Red Army. The cauldron was now split into 2 parts. There was no longer any telephone connection with the northern part. The 8th and 11th Corps were on their own. Almost every hour the enemy attacked from all sides, narrowing down the 2 cauldrons. Several generals without commands sat in the former city jail north of the Zaritsa, among them von Sedlitz, Pfeffer, Schlömer, De Boy, Laser, Edler von Daniels, and Colonel Stadel and Beaulieu. These senior officers, assembled by chance, had lived with the horrors of the battle, the gradual wasting away and dying of their troops from the very beginning. Now they saw no sense in continuing the fighting anymore. Their consciences warned them to request the destruction to cease fighting, even at the last minute. On the 27th January, the telephone rang near me. General Schlömer wanted to speak to the commander-in-chief. I asked him to wait a minute as I had to call Paulus to the telephone. It was a short conversation. Schlömer described the situation and the state of the troops, who were totally exhausted and no longer capable of resistance, and asked permission to surrender. The commander-in-chief reminded him of the order to hold on and put down the receiver. About half an hour later, Lieutenant General Schmidt entered the cellar room that I occupied with Paulus. Angrily, he reported a telephone conversation he had had with Colonel Müller, the chief of staff of the 14th Panzer Corps. General, the 14th Panzer Corps is considering surrender. Müller says that the troops have come to the end of their strength and no longer have any ammunition. I have told him that we are aware of the situation, but that, as before, we still have our orders to fight on, and that surrender is out of the question. Nevertheless, General, I suggest that you seek out this general yourself and talk to him." Paulus agreed. The journey to the city prison under enemy artillery fire was a risk, but they got through safely. Upon his return, Paulus told me that all the officers present had complained about Schmidt. To their quite justified questions and requests, they got only harsh words from him. They pointed out that their divisions were completely exhausted. The battle groups were already individually making contact with the enemy and surrendering. No one knew if their neighbors were still holding their positions, so it repeatedly happened that individual units were being attacked by the enemy from the flank and the rear and were destroyed. They were asking for orders to bring the unnecessary blood, leading to an end with the army's complete surrender. "What answer did you give them, Colonel General?" I asked him. "I referred the generals once more to Hitler's orders. Every day and every hour counts in tying down the enemy's powerful forces," countered Paulus. "The enemy's powerful forces? Do you really believe, Colonel General, that the Soviets are still using all the armies that we identified at the end of November within the city area? The cauldron is now completely shrunken. A fraction of the original troops is enough to eradicate us with a death thrust. The enemy knows our situation fully well. The way in which he is conducting the battle shows that he is not prepared to sacrifice lives unnecessarily. Naturally, the enemy will have withdrawn some of his forces, but the fact is that he still has some here." At any rate, the generals and colonels were of another opinion. "Hitler is a criminal" was one of the tamest expressions. As I was leaving the cellars of the town prison, I heard someone behind me say, "Just as we have been lied to, so will the German people be lied to. No newspaper, no radio will report the horrors that we have been experiencing for weeks. Goebbels will glorify our defeat." Paulus heard and knew all this, nevertheless he remained an obedient general. A new radio message from the Army High Command reinforced him in holding out further. It said that in case of the splitting of the cauldron, each part of the cauldron came personally under Hitler. On the 28th January, the northern cauldron was again split. The army reported that evening to the Army High Command. Strong enemy breach along the Gumrak-Stalingrad railway line split the army's front. In the northern cauldron 11th Corps, central cauldron 8th and List Corps, and southern cauldron 14th Panzer Corps and 4th Corps without units. Army seeking to form a new defensive front along the northern edge and western frontage. The army calculates the final collapse of its resistance by the 1st February. When dusk fell, I was sitting alone in our cellar. Paulus had gone over to Schmidt. The artillery fire had become so strong by day that we hardly dared venture into the yard. Now too the sounds of fighting were coming from all around. I lay down on my bed. The pitiless fighting continued outside. Every hour demanded new victims. No one counted them. For days now I had been unable to gather definite reports of losses. They ran only approximately. 76th Infantry Division on the 27th January severe losses, 44th Infantry Division completely beaten, 371st, 305th, 376th Infantry Divisions wiped out, 3rd Motorized Infantry Division reduced to only very weak combat teams, 29th Motorized Infantry Division no contact anymore. How many soldiers were still alive? How many combatants did we still have? How many wounded and sick were there in the cauldron? The doctors I had come across in the last few days spoke of 40,000 to 50,000. Did the combatants still have any ammunition? Were there still rations available? Were the wounded and sick being cared for? Apart from a few individual cases, these questions had to be answered with no. On the 29th January came the news that Lieutenant General Schmoller and other generals had received some Russian envoys and were negotiating a surrender with them. Schmidt threatened them with court-martial. At the same time, Colonel Steele appeared at the department store. He wanted to speak to Colonel General Paulus personally. He had been involved in the heavy fighting retreat from the west bank of the Don, when the new southern front of the cauldron was established, and lost almost a whole regiment of the 376th Infantry Division in defensive fighting. His soldiers regarded him as a brave and fair commander. Paulus treasured him for his reliability and frankness. 2 days earlier, on the 27th January, Stadel had said during a talk with the Commander-in-Chief that our responsibility to the soldiers and to the German people demanded the immediate cessation of the fighting. He had now come to ask Paulus to give the order to surrender. In doing so, he first spoke with Schmidt, who knew full well what was going on. Schmidt gruffly turned down the colonel's request for permission to speak with General Paulus and ordered him to go back to his troops immediately. Stiebel had to leave the department store without having performed his task. In these last days, Schmidt also developed a lively busyness in other respects. Thus, he ordered Colonel von Beaulieu, commander of an infantry regiment of the 3rd Motorized Infantry Division, to see him. This man, who had spent a long time in the Soviet Union during the 1920s, spoke the Russian language, knew the country and the people, and, as he stressed, was familiar with the Red Army. I had met him frequently since the beginning of the Eastern Campaign. Astonished, I greeted him as he left the Chief of Staff's room. Schmidt had me tell him about the Russian army. He was particularly interested in the question of what one could expect from their soldiers and officers. I had no idea that your Chief of Staff could be so friendly. Likewise, the interpreter of the List Corps was repeatedly called to headquarters to report to Schmidt. He was a Tsarist emigrant, a former landlord and ensign in the Tsarist army. With him, too, Schmidt discussed the land and the people and the soldiers and officers of the Red Army. What was causing the Chief of Staff to have these discussions? Could it be a preparation for captivity? Was he playing a double game? Already he had instructed Ross to prepare the department store for all-round defense. Was he also preparing himself for captivity? It was late evening on the 29th January, and I was walking in the dark passages of the cellars when someone tugged my sleeve. I thought at first that it must be one of the wounded who had sought shelter here in the last few days. But by the light of my pocket torch, I recognized Schmidt's orderly. The general himself was with Rosk, discussing defensive measures for the headquarters. The senior corporal led me into Schmidt's living room and pointed to a corner where a little suitcase stood. When he opened it, I bent down and then looked at the soldier in surprise. Then he said, smiling, "He orders all his subordinates to hold on, surrender being out of the question, while he himself is equipped for captivity." I thanked him for this very informative exposure and went to my room, so that is what it was all about. Schmidt was not applying to himself the order to fight to the last man. Paulus shook his head as he heard my observations. I would never have thought it possible. The man who has been spreading the rumors about prisoners being shot in the head carefully informs himself about the expected handling by the Red Army. He is reckoning on captivity, but lets no one else know about it. Schmidt was never my friend, but I took him to be consistent in his ways. But in the last few days he has shown his true self. His words and deeds are incompatible. It's a pity that you took his advice, Colonel General. Now it is too late to talk about it. We have reached the end. Perhaps another Chief of Staff from the General Staff would have helped to make better decisions. But let us leave it. Yes, the end was near. A comprehensive defensive position was no longer available. There were now only strong points that could be defended by battle groups. Such a strong point stood opposite the department store near the Zaritsa, which had already been crossed by the Red Army. It was occupied by Colonel Ludwig's battle group, for which the remains of the 14th Panzer Division were grouped as the Army's reserve. The battle group had set itself up in the ruins of a shop. On the ground and first floors, the window spaces had been barricaded with sandbags and bricks. This was now the forward position. The Red Army was already sitting in the Gorky Theater opposite. Colonel Ludwig regarded this as the last line of defense before the last headquarters. The building was already under direct fire from the enemy's infantry weapons. To the west of us, red-starred tanks were only a few streets away. We really were coming to the end. Before us now stood the question: suicide or captivity? While Paulus had previously dismissed the notion of suicide, he now began to waver. After a long deliberation, he said concernedly, "Hitler expects especially from me that I commit suicide. What do you think about that, Adam?" I was angry. Until now we have tried to prevent suicide in the army. This is and remains the right thing to do. You too have to share the fate of your soldiers. Should a shell hit our cellar, then we are dead. I would, however, regard it as shameful and cowardly should we end our lives by suicide. Paulus seemed to be free from pressure by my words. He basically thought the same as I did, but wanted to check the consequences of my argument once more. That was his way of doing things. Paulus' silence was now at an end. He began to recount his experiences and events in the Führer headquarters. As Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, subordinate to Colonel General Halder, Paulus had witnessed many of Hitler's outbursts of rage. In his presentations, Halder hardly ever got beyond his first sentence before Hitler overwhelmed him with words and went on talking. Paulus described how Hitler's greatest delusion was strongly reinforced by those subservient, praising people around him, with Field Marshal Keitel in the forefront. In the main, as seen through these accounts, Hitler's role and character stood out flashily and naked, and it was barely understandable, even unpardonable, that a person with such intimate knowledge of him had continued to be a follower. This was the 30th January 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's seizure of power. Schmidt had prepared 2 radio messages to Hitler, which Paulus had signed unaltered. The first read, "The Sixth Army has, faithful to its oath of allegiance, in view of its high and important task, held its position to the last man and the last bullet for Führer and Fatherland." Paulus. The second radio message included best wishes for the 30th January. "On the anniversary of your seizure of power, the Sixth Army congratulates its Führer. The swastika still flies over Stalingrad. Our battle has given the living and coming generations an example, also in the hopelessness of never surrendering, that Germany will win. Heil mein Führer Paulus, Karl Gen." Was that not a mockery of the Sixth Army's dreadful fate? Army headquarters could not have done Goebbels, as Reich's propaganda minister, a greater service. This radio message gave him an opportunity to glorify the senseless deaths. Hitler replied immediately, "My Colonel General Paulus." Already today the whole German people look upon this city with deep emotion. As always in world history, this sacrifice will not be in vain. The creed of von Clausewitz will find its fulfillment. The German nation now understands the whole difficulty of this battle and will make the greatest sacrifice. With thanks to you and your soldiers, your Adolf Hitler similar deceitful pathos-filled Göring speech of the 30th January 1943. Cynically, he reached out to the still living in the outermost lying cauldron, but also in the homeland. It is at last the end that sounds so hard. It is all the same to soldiers, whether fighting at Stalingrad, at Rzhev, or in the deserts of Africa, or over in the ice of Norway, who fight and fall. I was overcome with disgust as I listened to the fat Air Force Marshal. But my anger at Hitler's unscrupulous riffraff grew that after his shameless betrayal, they now also expected those of us still alive to listen to our own obituaries. Towards evening, Schmidt came excitedly to Paulus. "It has just been reported that Colonel Ludwig is dealing with the Russians. I have ordered his court-martial." Poor Ludwig was my first thought. It will not be easy for you. As soon as the Chief of Staff had gone away, I expressed my concerns, but Paulus calmed me down. I will not tolerate Ludwig being punished for his individual negotiations. Ludwig was taken away by an officer with a steel helmet and slung machine pistol. This looked very much like punishment, and fitted the formula that Schmidt had been using until now. Whoever makes individual contact with the enemy will be shot. Later Ludwig told me that he had expected the Chief of Staff to have him court-martialed, but something else happened. Schmidt first asked about the securing of the southern front, for which Ludwig was responsible. Then he asked him to sit down. Then came the question that Ludwig was expecting, cool and direct. "Tell me, I am listening. Have you been dealing with the Russians today?" The colonel reported how and why it had come to negotiation. He had taken this step because of the falling strength of the troops, and the tens of thousands of unattended wounded and sick. Schmidt watched him attentively as he was speaking. He did not interrupt him with a word, but simply paced to and fro restlessly in his cellar room. Several minutes after Ludwig had finished speaking, he suddenly came to a halt in front of him. "This is not easy for me. You are going straight over to the Russians, negotiating surrender, and nobody comes to us to headquarters." Ludwig did not quite understand this. This was one thing he had not considered. The pig-headed holding-out general was suddenly in favor of surrender. Did he now want to save his own life after having for weeks followed Hitler's and Manstein's strictest orders, and in doing so contributing considerably towards the downfall of the Sixth Army? "If that is all, General," answered Ludwig, "I believe that I can promise that early tomorrow, at about 9 a.m., a negotiator will be standing here in front of the cellar." "Good Ludwig, just do that. Now good night." Colonel Ludwig had never been so bewildered as he was after this conversation with Schmidt. The latter, following his conversation with the colonel, came to Paulus but did not tell him about the conversation, merely reporting that he had tasked Ludwig with negotiating the surrender of the army headquarters. This event rounded off the picture of Lieutenant General Schmidt. Only the day before he had been threatening execution by shooting, and now he was prepared to go into captivity. His life was apparently so precious that he did not want to fight with a gun in his hands. Naturally, the contradiction between fighting to the last round, as the troops had been ordered to do, and the generals and senior members of the staff giving up without a fight, did not occur to Schmidt, but this was particularly stupid of Schmidt, who, as the army's bad spirit, more than any other, had reacted fanatically and inexorably against any reasonable thinking. This made his military failure also a deeper failure of his human character. After the chief of staff had left, Major General Rosk appeared. Briefly and precisely he reported to Paulus, "The division is no longer in a position to resist any further. Russian tanks are approaching the department store. This is the end. Thank you, Rosk, for everything. Convey my thanks to your officers and soldiers." Schmidt has already asked Ludwig to negotiate with the Red Army. I threw the few last remaining pieces of paper into the stove, as well as the dozen Knight's crosses and German crosses, but my conscience would not let me part with my duty stamp. I threw it into my briefcase together with the ink pad. Then I went to my assistant, Lieutenant Schlesinger, and the clerks, to bring them up to date on the situation and check to see if everything had been destroyed here too. For an hour or more I sat with the army commander-in-chief in our narrow room. A candle flickered between us. Not a word was spoken. Both of us were busy with our own thoughts. Finally, I broke the silence. "Colonel General, you must get some sleep, otherwise you will not be able to stand all day tomorrow. It is going to cost us the rest of our nerves." Midnight was past when Paulus and I stretched out on our mattresses. I jumped up once to see Rosk. "Is there anything new?" I asked him as I entered. Rosk was destroying the last of the disposable items. He asked me to take a seat, handed me a cigarette and lit one for himself. "A red tank is standing in a side street quite close to here with its gun aimed at our ruins." I immediately reported this to Schmidt. He said that the tank must be prevented from shooting, as this could mean death for all of us. That is why an interpreter with a white flag should go over to the tank commander and start surrender negotiations. I will deal with them myself. Dear friends, that's all for today. Please support this video with any comment and don't forget to press like. It was Tim, and see you.